there.
So sorry, Jason.
The two people that were asking for it, I told them if it wasn't possible, I'd also be willing to share a copy. So
right. And either way, so why don't you, since you are going to start, Jason, why don't you share your access copy again in the chat, and then while I introduce you. So Jason is providing his access copy in the chat if anybody needs one. All right, so let me introduce Jason. So Jason is a PhD student at Purdue University. His research interests include narratives of disability in young adult literature and own voices authorship, particularly that of autist YA authorship. Much of his writing is informed by his lived experiences as an autistic Filipino American. His current research focused on how autist YA authorship both subverts and is constrained by the narrative traditions of medicalized autism. The title of Jason's paper is The Autism Narrative, Form in Children's and YA Literature. So Jason, take it away.
Hey, I guess first I probably want to describe myself in the background. So I have a visual description of that. I am in a room with a beige kind of walls, wearing a blue shirt, and I am a man with brown skin, black hair, and I'm wearing glasses. Okay, let me get started. There's an access copy if anyone needs it. I will stick pretty much closely to it. But yeah, if anyone needs it, that should be in the chat. The autism, sorry. I meant to put the video here so I can see. How do I see myself on the, you know what? Okay.
Do you have a PowerPoint to share, Jason, or you're just gonna share yourself?
I'm just going to read.
Okay. What are you trying to share? You just want to see yourself?
Oh, yeah, I wanted to see myself, but that's fine. I don't need to.
Usually if you do speaker view, it'll show you what you look like.
That's a good point. I am not on speaker view. Okay. That I think should do it. Oh, okay. The autism narrative. Autism is narrative form in children's and YA literature. Stories about autism serve as the means by which views about autistic people affix themselves to the dominant discourse. As John Duffy and Rebecca Dorner write, autism, as it's medically and culturally conceived, is essentially a narrative condition that deploys storytelling as a vehicle by which non-autistic people, quote, explain contrasts between the normal and abnormal, unquote. And according to James McGrath, these stories that, quote, shape both diagnostic and public understandings of the term, quote, surround us. In this presentation, I call these stories which have a significant impact on how autism is understood, quote, autism stories and, quote, autistic stories, two distinct modes of storytelling that are distinguished by who tells the story and the meaning it conveys. According to Remy Yergo, while autistic stories often take the form of, quote, angry blog posts, video narratives, comics, memoirs, or, as Yergo writes, extended middle fingers that take aim at neurotypical ableism and performative allyship, autism stories where, quote, non-autistic stakeholders become authorized autism somethings promote radically different non-meanings and effective responses. While I would argue that the promise of autistic authorship, the telling of autistic stories, is in their ability to undermine ableist understandings of what autism is, the need to critique neurotypical ableism in order to do so simultaneously reaffirms the centrality of issues of empathy, communication, and social relationships, frequently subjects of both autism stories and autistic stories. In other words, the telling of both autism stories and autistic stories invoke a kind of master narrative of autism, a narrative constructed through repeated representations that have over time become stereotypes about autism. And building off of Marta Puxon-Olivia's theorization of racial stereotype as narrative form, where stereotypes about race become strategies used for storytelling, I contend that in both autism stories and autistic stories, stereotypes about autism function similarly for both autistic and non-autistic authors. Thus, despite the subversive nature of autistic stories and attempts by autist authors to reframe medicalized autism as neurological difference rather than biological lack, neurotypical ableism exists as an essentializing force, shifting the burden of explaining what autism is to autistic authors. In this presentation, I explore autism as a strategy for telling stories through a comparison of its use in Mark Haddon's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime and Rachel Lucas's The State of Grace, an autism story and an autistic story. In Haddon's text, an allistic or non-autistic authored work of children's literature, stereotypes about autism inform his depiction of a protagonist with autistic traits, invoking a central premise of the traditional autism narrative based largely on theories about empathy or theory of mind, where autistic people possess an impaired theory of mind that limits their ability to infer internal thoughts and attitudes from externally observed words and behaviors. In Lucas's text, an autistic authored work of young adult fiction, the text subverts the traditional autism narrative by depicting empathy as dependent on systems of cultural knowledge, where the understanding of internal thoughts and attitudes largely depends on the cultural specific understandings of autistic behaviors, such as recognizing stimming as meaningful, which therefore inverts the more traditional understandings of autism by showing the potential of ableism within medical diagnostic criteria to limit the ability of non-autistic people to understand the internal thoughts and attitudes of autistic people. While in this presentation, I refer to autistic stories as autism stories and autistic stories to highlight the way that these stories differ and to preserve a critical distance. Such stories are also connected as two opposing sides to a narrative form. As Puxon-Olivia argues, quote, stereotypes in fiction often function as, quote, narrative forms or as strategies for telling stories, noting that the stereotype becomes a mode of narration that unfolds and has specific functions within the narrative. In narratives about race, she observes that differing approaches to telling a story form a, quote, dual structure, where the story invokes known stereotypes that, quote, completely determine the representation. In other words, I focus the center of this paper not only on the ways in which the aims and strategies of autistic stories collectively depart from the aims and strategies of autism stories, but also on how the stories told by holistic authors serve as dehumanizing yet important departure points for autistic authors. Mark Haddon's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime is a work of holistic or non-autistic author fiction with a seemingly autistic protagonist. In the story, Christopher, a 15-year-old boy, discovers his neighbor's deceased poodle cruelly impaled by a pitchfork in her backyard. Over the course of the narrative, Christopher discovers that his mother, whom his father had told him had passed, is actually alive. Haddon's The Curious Incident, echoing a number of common stereotypes about autistic people, depicts Christopher as someone who lacks empathy, is unaware of a world outside himself, and is often prone to violent outbursts. For example, when a police officer aggressively questions Christopher, how Christopher came to find the remains of the neighbor's dog, suspecting Christopher himself had killed the animal, Christopher is unable to explain his presence to the officer's satisfaction, ultimately punching the officer after becoming frustrated by their inability to communicate and overstimulated by the officer's persistence in interrogating him. This portrayal of Christopher's lacking empathy is echoed when Christopher's father arrives at the police station and appeals to the detective to release him. The detective, clearly seeking a reason to release him, says that Christopher's father informed him that his actions were involuntary. He then asks the protagonist, "Did you mean to hit the policeman?" Christopher tells the detective that he did indeed intend to hit the police officer, and the detective becomes visibly frustrated. He then rephrases his question, asking if Christopher wanted to, quote, harm the police officer. Thus, Haddon portrays Christopher as incapable of understanding the motive behind the detective's series of questions, ignoring the subtle prompts and responding to each question literally. As Michelle Racine observes, Haddon's repeated portrayal of Christopher as incapable of empathy is a strategic tactic on the part of the author that encourages the reader to, quote, step into the detective role that Christopher is unable to fulfill. The author's use of empathy as a narrative device also invokes stereotypes of the autistic as dangerous or as responsible for domestic disputes and broken marriages. When Christopher stumbles upon the box that his father had given hidden away, he reads a letter addressed to him from his mother. She writes, quote, maybe if things had been different, maybe if you had been different, I might have been better at it, blaming her physical violence toward her husband and abandonment of her family on Christopher's public meltdowns. Like Haddon's text, holistic authored texts that feature autistic characters often forward this medicalized view of autism. An autistic authored text present a different view, reframing autism as neurological difference rather than deficit. However, the presence of ableist narratives that create autism stereotypes can at times function as an essentializing force. Therefore, a perceived need to address ableism views can be felt in the opening pages of many autistic authored texts. In Rachel Lucas's State of Grace, one such autistic authored text, the author confronts a number of stereotypes about autism and even reverses the reader protagonist hierarchy seen in texts like Haddon's. Lucas's text is a story about a young autistic girl, Grace, whose daily routine is disrupted. In the story, Grace's ability to cope with her sensory environment is, among other things, affected by the absence of her father, the sudden start of a relationship, and issues with bullying at school. While many of the themes present in the text are similar to that of Haddon's, Lucas confronts the idea of autism as empathy deficit by positioning Grace as the means by which readers are able to access the minds of characters. And throughout the story, Grace repeatedly demonstrates an ability to infer what others are thinking based on their words and behaviors given in a given context. In the early pages of the narrative, when Grace finds herself sitting outside the school principal's office, listening to a conversation between the principal and her mother, Grace's ability to empathize with other characters to infer thoughts and motives mediates the reader's understanding of those characters. When the school principal criticizes Grace for leaving the class suddenly, criticizing or characterizing her actions as a kind of moral or disciplinary failure, Grace hears her mother speak up for her, explaining how Grace's home life has affected her sensory regulation. Outside the room, Grace can, quote, feel the atmosphere crackle, and pictures her mother's hands, quote, balling into fists under the table, back straightening defensively, chin raising. After hearing one verbal exchange, Grace observes that her mother's voice had begun to sound spiky, noting that when her mother is feeling angry, quote, she gets more clipped and posh. Lucas's representation of autism in autistic people differs greatly from ableist stereotypes. Grace, outside the room, where her ability to observe the conversation is limited, is still able to perceive the extent of her mother's frustration. Moreover, Grace's ability to anticipate how her mother feels based on similar events in the past echoes Milton's theory of Damien Milton's theory of empathy as dependent on one's understanding of another's cultural context. According to Damien Milton, the behavioral therapies for autistic people aimed at conditioning individuals to fit within neurotypical society. Those aimed at perceived autistic empathy deficits ignore, quote, the universal issue of relationality and interaction in the formation of a contested and constantly reconstructed social reality. produced through the agency of its actors. In other words, the experiences of neurotypical people and autistic people are vastly different. And while an autistic person may at times fail to recognize forms of communication they've not internalized, particularly if they're not actively looking at it for it, holistic people may at times rely too heavily on such norms and fail to recognize others. Additionally, given the composition of most households and communities where an autistic person is likely to be surrounded only by holistic people, this dynamic often requires the autistic person to consciously adopt such behavioral practices. Or behavioral practices that do not come natural to their neurotype in order to make themselves readable. In the absence of such practices, the autistic body often risks becoming unreadable. While Lucas depicts Grace, an autistic character, as having an awareness of what others are thinking or feeling, and thus fully capable of empathy, neurotypical characters are often shown to be lacking empathy toward Grace and failing to understand what her words and behaviors signify. In the principal's exchange with Grace's mother, the principal exclaims, "Obviously, we're doing everything we can for Grace." The stress on the word obvious highlights the way in which Grace reverses the hierarchy of the knowable in the text, or highlights the way in which Lucas reverses the hierarchy of the knowable in the text. What is obvious to Grace and made obvious to the reader, though, through Grace's narration, is that Grace's stimming, difficulty speaking, and unexplained departure from the classroom signify an unbearable level of anxiety produced by sensory overstimulation in a less than sensory friendly classroom, something which teachers and school administrators fail to infer from Grace's words and behaviors. After meeting with Grace's mother, the school principal asked Grace to refrain from leaving the classroom in the future, quote, even if she was feeling a little overwhelmed, adding that afterwards she can, quote, always tell the teacher if she needs time out. There is a degree of difference between the environment that is characterized here and how Grace describes it. Rather than simply being quote, a little overwhelmed, Grace describes this feeling in the moment as if, quote, the walls were collapsing on her. While Grace's description suggests an unbearable level of anxiety and a desperate need to remove herself from the situation, the principal's words suggest only a feeling of mild irritation. In other words, how Grace experiences the school environment is something that is decisively not obvious to this principal. The difference between Grace's understanding of how she felt and the principal's assumption reflects a tendency for holistic individuals to internalize beliefs about norms of social communication as universal. For many such individuals to see autistic words and behaviors as only signs of disability. As Remy Ergo observes in authoring Autism, autistic acts are often removed from the realm of rhetoricity, as autism is medically construed as a series of involuntarities and are instead understood as that which, quote, precludes one from accessing self-knowledge and knowledge of human others. That is to say, autistic acts such as stimming, withdrawal, meltdown, or shutdown that might otherwise be recognized as signifying anxiety, distress, or distress are instead reduced to mere symptoms of the disorder that impair rather than facilitate communication. While autistic authorship, as I've hopefully shown, has the potential to challenge oppressive power structures such as those that render autists subaltern by problematizing the neurotypical pathologization of empathy, it's also true that there are similarities between these texts which reflect constraints of by the dominant stereotypes about autism. The similarities between these texts beg the question of what autistic texts might look like without such restraints on the terms of our thematic engagement.
Thank you, Jason. So those of you that are here know that our other speaker has not shown, so we can address questions that you might have for Jason right now. You can either put things in the chat, you can raise your hand. Anybody have some questions for Jason about his paper?
Did you want those now or like at the end of the talk?
Well,
I didn't know if.
We only have 2 speakers and the other speaker isn't here.
Oh, okay.
So,
For some reason, I thought there were 3 or
usually
so.
I would save them for the end, but our other speaker
Yeah, this
hasn't
is
shown.
it.
So let's go ahead and ask Jason right now if you've got him. Kristen?
I'm kind of interested in the ways in which autism is now discussed as one version of neurodiversity, and the ways in which it's often posited as a spectrum. And from what I hear from your paper, and correct me if I'm wrong, that spectrum isn't really being talked about in children's literature. It's like being labeled and defined as a certain set of qualities. Do you think there's a potential for looking at the spectrum in children's literature, or do you think that it tends to, most of my students, for example, their understanding of autism is really Rain Man, period. Right.
So the issue of the spectrum is a difficult one, because the autistic community has, for reasons that relate to links between the creation of Asperger's as a category and the participation of the doctor that created that with in genocide and that kind of whole history moved away from some things. And as far as like the autism as a spectrum is concerned, like there's a relationship between that and functioning labels, which the spectrum is based on. So I think that is partly why there's been movement away from that, which, I mean, there are some, I would say that there are some issues that I see just based on what the idea that you have embedded stories, that embedded narratives and stereotypes, and they become kind of a conceptual framework, like what Yurgo suggests of disclosure is when you don't disclose, when you don't define it for yourself, the dominant discourse does that for you. So I think there's some issues with it. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how that would what that would result in. I don't think that justifies the use of a spectrum in critiquing literature just based on the connections there. But I kind of question whether the absence of any sort of thing kind of pushes us back to disparate categories.
To clarify, I don't mean that we can use a spectrum to rank the literature so much as do the characters, are they allowed to be presented in children's literature as multiple points on a spectrum, or are they often coded as just one, that autism is this and those are the characteristics of the child?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of scholarship does veer away from that because of a hesitance to base everything on functioning, which has also capitalist implications, because it's this idea that, the more functioning you are is based on your ability to produce value for a capitalist economy. So I think there are some issues there. So that's kind of why the the whole autism as one category also.
Well, and Jason, I don't know if you saw Rachel's addition to the discussion, but she says there's a discussion of the spectrum and functioning labels as being how autism presents to neurotypical people rather than the embodied experience of people with autism. And I'm just wondering, as I'm listening to Kristen talk, it seems almost like you're asking to, like, as if there's a single story, right? If we think about Adichie's idea of a single story, the same thing, there's not a single story of autism. It sounds like, Jason, that's what you're talking about, but that it often gets presented that way. I think definitely in terms of media, does your research, so I'm going to kind of follow up that question, does your research, because it sounds like this is what your dissertation's on, have you found in adolescent and or children's literature a kind of a breadth of experiences in the work that you're looking at?
Breadth of experiences in terms of,
or of those
embodied, like
Mm-hmm.
different ways of embodying autism. That definitely. So I mean, often I would say that I mean, I would say it's really about intersectionality, and when it comes to like different ways of embodying autism, not just in terms of not just in terms of functioning. I guess the right word might be singularity, because I'm thinking of like post-colonial singularity, maybe a little bit like that. So the way I've been seeing it is often I see a relationship between I see different kind of groups within the community and how they present themselves, and they differ based on that. So there's there's a difference between how autistic people, narrative by autistic people often, and narrative by autistic parents. But often there are a lot of autistic authors who are both parent and autistic. So sometimes I see kind of some groups straddling categories like that between ally and disabled. And then also people are often multiply disabled. So narrative by people who are both autistic and ADHD will inevitably differ from those who are just autistic. And then there are just different kind of experiences that I often see in these narratives. So I can kind of maybe categorize them in that way, like narratives of school, and based on age and things like that. So there's often this idea of the school environment, or a social environment, some common things there. Even in the even if you've read Green Duvet's On the Edge of Gone, which is a kind of post-apocalyptic, they still have some elements of the difficulties of school there. So it's strange how that's like almost in every single one. But yeah, I don't, my memory is terrible. I think I may have moved on from the question.
That's fine. Are there other questions from audience members that you have for Jason? Rachel.
Yeah, hi. I love that. I thought it was really interesting. I was wondering if you'd done any work with or on autistic coded characters, or whether you tend to look at or exclusively look at narratives where people have been like explicitly referred to as autistic.
I typically work with autistic authored texts, and there are a few which they're only labeled autistic paratextually, which is actually very interesting. So they're within the text, they are coded in that way. I tend to stray away from referring to characters as autistic if there's no material on that, because that's kind of a problematic trend within our culture to diagnose other people. Or I see it that way, so I've kind of strayed away from that. Had on actually, it's really interesting because there's in the text, it's very problematic for a lot of the content that it contains, but it's nowhere in there is the character labeled autistic. But there are like specific moments within the text in a longer version of the material, some of the material I presented here. I do kind of draw parallels between published writing by Temple Grandin and some of the things that are almost line for line. So I think that also presents a difficulty because these are things that are out there that people base characters on. It's just being able to identify that as hard.
That's great. Thank you.
Other questions for Jason? I have one.
I put my
go ahead.
stuff in the
Go ahead,
chat.
Rashida.
Sorry.
No, good.
I was gathering dinner for my daughter, and I put in the chat like how could I encourage my student teachers. They teach high school English to make their lessons a little bit more diverse. And I was going to put another question in, like, I guess, how can you become more of an ally for students who are autistic, or encourage people to learn more, and how do I learn more? And I'm sorry, I'm using my cell phone, so I couldn't see how to unmute.
And that's okay, Rashida. And I think you might have sent the questions just to Jason, since I didn't see them, or I would have read them for you. So I appreciate you asking. Jason, you want to help?
Yeah. I need to hold on. Let me pull up the full. Well, since I was talking, I didn't have the transcript up, so I think I can respond to part of that though. But so when working with what I do when working with students, I think has probably been more informed by like engagement with disability studies than my own experience as an autistic person. So but I tend to focus more on access needs and invite people to talk about access needs rather than disclosing disability. And they're just kind of a handful of things, like because diagnosis is often a reflection of privilege, right? It costs money. Often the people who are not diagnosed are people of color, people without the means to do so, who lack money, who lack health insurance, right? Avoiding things that require disclosure is often very important for that.
I don't know if you see the question, Jason, but she asked also about becoming an ally.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that becoming an ally, and I think what I'm really trying to say is, if we're talking about in the classroom, removing barriers, I think that's the best way to become an ally. Thinking about what are the institutional barriers in place that often result in, say, autistic people dropping out of school, things like that. Because a lot of that, what I research and read is often related to how things like that are more structural barriers than just simply people's dispositions. That that's there too, but there are often things like how we read attention, and how we assign kind of a moral quality to whether someone is looking you in the eye or not, things like that. How we read eye contact as signifying whether someone is listening or not. How we read stimming as distraction rather than focus. So, both removing barriers in terms of like institutional structures, but also in terms of how we understand communication and how we're working within, with students who are autistic. Because if you're, not reading those things as focus, because often when autistic people are overstimulated, they might visibly stim because they want to tune out the other things and listen to you. So, those kind of things can present barriers. So becoming an ally might mean, reconsidering how we're understanding things, or inviting people to help us define them.
Rashida, I don't know, I was going to put this in the chat, but I don't know if you have access to the chat because of how you're listening to us, but Abby Meyer, spelled M-E-Y-E-R is her last name, has a book coming out in the spring called From Wallflowers to Bulletproof Families, The Power of Disability in Young Adult Narratives. And it might also suggest some possible books or, even books that might be linked to movies, just based on the paper I heard you give earlier yesterday, but that you might want to use in your class. So, or with your students. So Abby's done a lot of work on disability studies in YA specifically, and I think maybe some children's literature as well, that might be helpful. So,
okay.
So I was going to email you anyway, because I was going to give you my friend's information. I'll send that in the email. Okay. Jason, do you have another question in the, well, before we move on, Rashida, does that give you some starting ideas?
Yeah, thank the both of you. It's like 7:53 here in South Carolina, but I really did want to attend this session, and I just wanted to take my hat off to the presenter. You put a lot of thoughts in my mind as you presented, and you did an excellent job. Mm-hmm. And I wish I could take notes, but I was driving. So some of the things I had to I'm on my cell phone, so I had to kind of screenshot some of the things you were saying. So I just wanted to compliment you and thank you both for answering both of my questions. Even though it's late, I'm very stimulated and I'm very interested in the topic. So thank you for addressing my question.
I posted a link in the chat also Remy Yergo there was a autism conference where they spoke specifically about addressing institutional barriers and working with autistic students. So I think that might I found that useful. So I put that in the chat.
So Rashida, I can save the chat and email it to you in case you don't have access to it via your phone. I don't know the limitations on some of the WOBA and Zoom, if I'm saying that right, with phones. So
Yeah.
if that will help you, I got your email from yesterday, so I can send it to you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Not a problem. Jason, I don't know if you see Rachel's question. I'll go ahead and read it for those of you that may not have access to the chat. She said, if it's not too personal, she was wondering whether or not you feel you see yourself in these narratives as a non-white man. As an autistic woman who wasn't diagnosed until I turned 18, I find it really difficult to see my own experiences reflected in literature, and even less so in film, TV, I would argue. I had a similar question, but again, if it's not too personal, I was curious too about, because you identified early on as a Filipino autistic man.
I would say that it works both ways. That in some ways, I read what is it? Carlos. I'll read Carlos Bulasan's America's in the Heart, or other things like that, or either Filipino representation or Asian American representation, things like that. And there's some, there will be moments of ableism and things like that, where where I feel that kind of difference. And then also moments within some autistic authored texts where it's very apparent that or reading across different texts, that it's very apparent that most of these are not written by people of color. I mean, with the exception of anyone's read All the Weight of Our Dreams. It's a really interesting anthology, which there were some things in the first edition that the editors did not catch because it's an anthology produced of autistic people of color, produced by autistic people of color. But there was one I think story, maybe short fiction, that contained some things that they didn't really catch the first time, and they the second edition is going to be republished, so you might not be able to get that. But if you're interested, there's a it's all by autistic people of color. It doesn't necessarily address issues of disability and race. Sometimes it's either one or the other, which is interesting that you have a text that has the kind of goals that they set out with this, and you still see that there. But yeah, most of them aren't. Most of the texts aren't very diverse in terms of race. As far as gender, there's a lot of autistic women that are represented within literature, though.
That's great. Thank you.
Other questions for Jason? Jason, I don't want you to feel like you're gonna have to talk for a whole nother hour, but I do want to make sure that if people have other questions that we get them asked since we have the time.
I don't mind if people don't mind that I ramble.
So I have another question for you, Jason, and I this may not be clearly articulated in my mind, but from what I know, and it's been a while since I read Haddon's novel, he didn't write it as adolescent literature, even though it often is used as adolescent literature. Do you find that difference in audience for that book versus the other book that you were mentioning, that has any bearing on or adds to your discussion of the distinctions? Thanks, Cindy.
So that is something that I've kind of been grappling with, and I don't know. It's very strange that a lot of texts that are written by non-autistic people about autism are in children's literature, and a great deal of texts that are written by autistic people about, with autistic protagonists are YA literature. And I don't know why that is. And it's a very curious thing. And I mean, I just kind of guess maybe. But yeah, so like as far as, what to say about audience and, that you have an implied child in the case of autistic authors, it's an implied autistic child because often the authors are, grappling with issues that they've experienced. They'll explicitly say that they're writing for either their own children or so that children feel represented. But the only thing I've really kind of got out of that is that there's always this kind of relationship between, so I think there's a relationship always between, I guess a better way to say it might be that all autistic authors probably have some sort of proximity to, I guess, the status of ally almost, or because they're writing for an autistic child often who is not themselves. So it's not necessarily the same. I don't, or in my view, it's not. I see some similarities between like autistic parents and autistic writers because of that. That's not necessarily for there's this implied child still in play there.
Great. Well, we are starting to lose audience, I think partly because it's late and partly because we had just one paper. So if you don't have further questions for Jason, let me just take a minute to encourage, if any of you are interested in being the person that organizes the panels next year. You don't have to commit to it right now. You could always email me and let me know. I mean, I can do it again if we need to, because I am close to LA. Next year's panel or conference will be in UCLA, November 11th through 13th in person. They are looking at having some more virtual events next year, but the main PAMLA conference will be November 11th to the 13th. If you are interested, your responsibility would be to put together a call for papers, to market the panel, drum up support for the different panels. Stay in touch with emails, stay in touch with Craig for all of it. And I don't know if I said this, but you would have to commit to attending the conference in LA next year. So if you are interested, let me put in the here, you can send me an email and I can always give you more information. I know that this may not be the best time of year to ask people to commit to things because we're all getting a little overwhelmed with that point of the semester, but I do want to provide an opportunity if it is something that interests you to either take on the role, or I could always work with you if you wanted a transition to doing it the next year. Any questions about any of that or potential interest in putting together? You would only have to do one. I did two, because except for that we lost a couple people in this particular panel, but we had a number of really good papers, and I didn't want to cut out some people. So I'm sorry that we didn't get to hear about the representation of people of African descent that Laverne Seals was going to talk to us about. But in any case, if you are interested, you can stay and talk to me. Let me know. You may email me at mstewart, STEWART, at msjc.edu. And otherwise, I'll just stay on. I've got to turn off this recording, Jason, so I don't forget. I don't want to lose it. I forgot to turn it off with our questions, but